He walked into that courtroom carrying a bottle of champagne, not metaphorically, an actual bottle. Dom Perignon, still cold, condensation running down the glass, like the whole thing was already a celebration. Damien Cross had one arm around his 29-year-old girlfriend, laughing at something she whispered in his ear, and he didn't even look at his wife of 22 years when he passed her in the aisle. Didn't even glance. Like she was furniture. Like she was already gone. That was his first mistake. But it wasn't his last. If you've ever watched someone underestimate the wrong person, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, hit that like button. Now let me take you back to where this really started. The champagne cork hit the marble floor of Manhattan Family Court at 9:47 in the morning. It made a sound like a small gunshot. The court officer at the door actually reached for his radio before he realized what he was hearing. A few attorneys in the gallery looked up from their phones. An older woman sitting near the back, there for her own hearing, her own quiet disaster, pressed her lips together and stared. Damien Cross didn't notice any of them. He was already pouring. Damien. His attorney, a sharp-faced man named Gerald Fitch, grabbed his arm. We are in a courtroom. Relax, Gerald. Damien handed a plastic cup. He'd brought plastic cups, had planned this, to Vanessa Hale, who took it with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. This is a formality. 45 minutes, we walk out, and we go to lunch at Per Se. I already made the reservation. Gerald Fitch looked across the room to where Claire Bennett sat alone at the opposing table. He had been a divorce attorney for 31 years. He had seen a lot of things in courtrooms. But something about the way Claire Bennett was sitting, not anxious, not tearful, not rifling through papers with shaking hands, the way most people did in these rooms, made the back of his neck feel cold. She was just sitting there with her hands folded on the table and her posture perfectly straight, wearing a navy coat that probably cost more than most people's rent, looking like a woman who was waiting for a bus she already knew was coming. Gerald had tried to tell Damien twice that something felt off about how the opposing counsel had been communicating. Too calm, too cooperative, like people who weren't actually worried. Damien had not wanted to hear it. Claire heard the champagne cork. She didn't turn around. Her attorney, a woman named Patricia Okafor, leaned in close and said very quietly, "He brought drinks." "I know," Claire said. "I could smell it from the door." Patricia paused. "How do you feel?" Claire thought about that for a moment. The honest answer was complicated. There was something happening in her chest that she couldn't name exactly. Not quite sadness, not quite satisfaction. Something more like the feeling you get when you've been holding a very heavy bag for a very long time, and you can finally see the place where you're going to be able to set it down. "I feel fine," she said, which was close enough to true. The formal proceedings began at 10 o'clock. Judge Evelyn Harper was 63 years old, had been on the family court bench for 19 years, and had approximately zero tolerance for theater. She came through the side door, took her seat, looked out at the courtroom with the expression of someone who had already made peace with how long human beings could spend making simple things complicated, and said, "Cross versus Bennett, we're on the record. Mr. Fitch, I understand you have preliminary remarks." Gerald Fitch stood. He was good at this part, the smooth, authoritative opening that set the frame. He spoke for 6 minutes about Damien Cross's extraordinary success, his self-made journey, his charitable contributions to the city of New York, his role as the founding visionary of Cross Holdings. He said the word visionary 3 times. Claire looked at her hands. When Patricia Okafor stood, she spoke for 2 minutes. She said that the court's time was valuable. She said that the relevant documents had already been submitted. She said that the question before the court today was not about contribution or character, but about a single straightforward legal fact, which would become clear shortly. She sat back down. Judge Harper looked at her for a moment longer than necessary. Then she nodded and said, "Let's proceed." The first hour was what Gerald Fitch had designed it to be, a portrait of Damien Cross as architect of his own empire. A financial consultant named Robert Helms testified about Cross Holdings' growth trajectory, 47 properties, commercial and residential developments across 4 states, a net worth that had been estimated conservatively at somewhere north of $800 million. He had charts. He had graphs. He had the kind of presentation that was meant to make the number feel real, feel earned, feel like the product of one exceptional man's will. Damien sat at his table with his arms crossed, and the expression of a person watching a documentary about themselves. Pleased, bored in a satisfied way. Vanessa, in the gallery behind him, was scrolling her phone. She'd been scrolling since the proceedings started. She stopped occasionally to take small sips from a water bottle. Then Patricia Okafor stood up for cross-examination. She asked Robert Helms one question. Mr. Helms, in your analysis of Cross Holdings' founding period, specifically the years 2001 through 2004, did you review the original project financing records for the company's first 3 renovation contracts? Helms blinked. I reviewed the summary financial documents provided by the originals, Patricia said. Not the summaries. The originals. A pause. No. Thank you, Patricia said. No further questions. It was the second witness that changed the temperature in the room. Her name was Dorothy Reyes, and she was 71 years old, and she had been the bookkeeper for Cross Renovations, the tiny company that became Cross Holdings, from 2001 to 2008. She walked slowly to the witness stand with a cane and the absolute unshakable composure of a woman who had decided before she left the house that morning that she was going to tell the truth, and nothing in this world was going to stop her. Gerald Fitch stood to examine her, and she answered his questions politely and without giving him anything he could use. Then Patricia Okafor approached with a manila folder. Mrs. Reyes, she said, I'm showing you Exhibit 14C, which is the original check register for Cross Renovations covering the period January through October of 2001. Can you tell the court what you're looking at? Dorothy Reyes put on her reading glasses. She studied the document for a moment with the thoroughness of someone who had spent a career caring about accuracy. This is the check register from the early days, she said. Original deposits and disbursements. And can you tell the court where the initial capital funding came from? The first 2 deposits that made the company operational? Dorothy found the lines with her finger. First deposit, March 4th, 2001, $38,500. Drawn from a personal account held in the name of Claire Marie Bennett. She moved her finger. Second deposit, April 22nd, 2001, $51,000 even. Same account. The courtroom was quiet. So to be clear, Patricia said, the initial capital that made Cross Renovations financially operational came from Claire Bennett's personal funds? From her family's savings, is what she told me at the time, Dorothy said. She was very matter-of-fact about it. Said she'd been saving since she was a girl. I remember because I thought it was brave. In the gallery, Vanessa Hale looked up from her phone for the first time since the proceedings started. Damien leaned over to Gerald and said, in a voice just loud enough that the court reporter's expression flickered, This doesn't matter. This is ancient history. Gerald said nothing. Gerald, this doesn't matter. Keep your voice down, Gerald said quietly. And there was something in the way he said it. Not the usual reassuring we've got this tone, but something flatter, something careful, that for the first time planted a small seed of unease in Damien's stomach. He looked across the room at Claire. She still hadn't looked at him. The third witness was a man named Thomas Ellery, 64, a former project manager who had worked for Cross Renovations from its second year until 2010. He was not there to talk about money. Patricia asked him about the early projects, the renovation work that had made their reputation, the designs that had convinced wealthy buyers on the Upper West Side, in Park Slope, in Carroll Gardens, that this small company was doing something different, something that felt like art rather than construction. Who designed the homes? Patricia asked. The interior layouts, the renovations, the aesthetic vision that clients were paying for. Where did that come from? Thomas Ellery looked briefly at Damien Cross, then looked away. Claire, he said. It was always Claire. She had a gift for it. She'd walk through a space, and she could see it already, what it wanted to be. Damien was good at the business side, negotiating contracts, that kind of thing. But the designs? That was her, every time. Did she receive credit for that work publicly? A long pause. Thomas Ellery had the look of a man choosing his words with some care, not because he wanted to lie, but because the truth was not simple. Not in the way she deserved, he said finally. In the early days, yes, people knew. But as the company got bigger, he stopped, shrugged with one shoulder. The story changed. How did it change? It became his story, Thomas said. The self-made man. The visionary. The word landed differently now than it had when Gerald Fitch used it. And Claire, She kind of disappeared from it. I noticed it happening. I don't think she said much about it. Did that surprise you? Honestly? Thomas looked at the judge. No, she was always like that. She didn't need the credit. She knew what she'd done. He paused. I don't think she realized at the time that he was going to take everything else too. At the lunch recess, Damien pulled Gerald into the hallway. Tell me what's happening, he said. I've been telling you, Gerald said quietly, for 6 weeks, that their case was unusually calm. I said something felt, what is she doing, Gerald? What is the point of this? The company is in my name. Cross Holdings is my company. Whatever she's trying to build about who designed what 20 years ago, it doesn't change. Damien, Gerald stopped walking. He turned to face him directly, and there was something in his expression that Damien had never seen there before in 15 years of working together. Something that looked a lot like pity. They submitted something this morning that I need you to look at. Before this afternoon, we need to talk about a document. Damien stared at him. What document? Gerald looked at his watch. They had 43 minutes. Come with me, he said. Vanessa found Claire in the women's restroom. She hadn't planned to. She just needed to use the restroom, and there was Claire standing at the sink washing her hands with the same unbothered composure she'd had all morning. They looked at each other in the mirror. Vanessa was 29 and beautiful, and she'd been told all her life that being beautiful and attached to a powerful man was a kind of security. She'd believed it. She'd built her whole present life around believing it. Something about the way Claire Bennett looked at her in that mirror made Vanessa feel, for the first time, genuinely uncertain about that. I don't want any trouble, Vanessa said, which was a stupid thing to say, and she knew it as soon as it came out. Claire turned off the faucet, reached for a paper towel. There isn't going to be any trouble, she said. Her voice was even. Not unkind, exactly, but not warm either. The voice of someone who had long since decided that this person in front of her was not worth anger. You didn't do anything to me that he didn't do first. You should think about that. She dried her hands, dropped the paper towel, walked to the door. She stopped with her hand on the handle. One thing, she said without turning around. Whatever you've been told about what he owns, you might want to spend this afternoon paying attention. She left. Vanessa stood in the fluorescent light of the courthouse bathroom for a long moment. Then she went back to find her seat. The afternoon session began at 1:15. Patricia Okafor approached the bench. Your Honor, at this time, the respondent would like to submit Exhibit 31A into evidence. This is a signed transfer of ownership agreement executed in 2016, notarized and filed with the New York State Department of State, transferring sole controlling interest of Cross Holdings, LLC, and all subsidiary companies to Claire Marie Bennett. The room went very still. Judge Harper looked at the document. She looked at it for a long time. Counselor, she said, is this what I think it is? Yes, Your Honor, Patricia said. Signed by Damien Cross himself. Witnessed, notarized, legally filed 7 years ago. Damien Cross sat completely motionless at his table. Gerald Fitch had a yellow legal pad in front of him. He was not writing on it. He was not moving. He was just sitting there with the expression of a man watching a building he designed fall down. Mr. Cross? Judge Harper's voice had changed. Not louder. Quieter, actually. More deliberate. The voice of someone who has seen many things and is deciding in real time what category this one belongs in. Were you aware that this transfer had never been reversed? Damien opened his mouth. He closed it. He opened it again and said, It was supposed to be Mr. Cross. The judge's voice was not a question anymore. Were you aware? A very long silence filled the room. In the gallery, Vanessa Hale had gone completely still, her water bottle forgotten in her hand. I thought, Damien started. I'm going to need a direct answer, the judge said. Gerald Fitch put his hand on Damien's arm and said something very quietly that no one else in the room could hear. Damien sat back. And Claire Bennett, for the first time since she walked into that courtroom that morning, allowed herself to look directly at her husband of 22 years, who was staring at the table in front of him. She watched him for a moment. There was no satisfaction on her face, not the way people imagined there would be. There was just something quiet and final, the way a door looks after it has been closed. She turned back to face the front of the room. The afternoon light came through the high windows of the courtroom in long, pale lines, and Judge Evelyn Harper was still reading, and the only sound was the faint whisper of pages turning, and somewhere behind Damien Cross, the sound of plastic hitting tile as Vanessa Hale quietly set down her cup. The ruling would come before 4 o'clock. But in that room, at that moment, everyone already knew. Everyone except the man who had walked in with champagne. The lunch recess had lasted 43 minutes, and in that time Gerald Fitch had shown Damien the document. Not a copy. The original filing, retrieved from New York State records, stamped, certified, carrying Damien's own signature in the blue ink of a man who had signed it believing it would never matter. Gerald had laid it on the table in a small conference room down the hall from courtroom 7, and Damien had sat across from it the way you sit across from something that doesn't make sense yet, the way your brain keeps rejecting what your eyes are sending it. "This isn't right," Damien had said. Gerald hadn't answered. "This isn't right. I signed this for the lawsuit. The Harmon lawsuit. You remember that. 2016. Harmon Construction was going after us for the Tribeca contract dispute. And you said we needed to move assets temporarily. You said—" "I said temporarily," Gerald said. "Yes. So I also sent you the reversal paperwork in March of 2017. Gerald's voice was very controlled. The voice of a man who had spent the last 6 weeks slowly understanding that he was going to be standing exactly where he was standing right now. "Twice. The second time by certified mail." Damien stared at him. "You never signed the reversal, Damien." The silence in that small conference room had been the loudest thing Damien Cross had heard in years. Louder than any negotiation, any argument, any boardroom he'd ever commanded. It was the silence of a man realizing that the floor he'd been standing on was not what he thought it was. "She was supposed to sign it back," he said finally. His voice had gone strange, flat. "She knew what it was for. She understood it was temporary." "Did you ask her to sign it back?" A pause that lasted too long. "I assumed," Damien said. Gerald picked up the document and put it back in his folder. He didn't say anything else for a moment. Then, "She sent you a certified letter in the fall of 2017, confirming that she considered the transfer permanent and intended to retain the ownership interest." He looked at Damien directly. "Do you remember receiving that?" Damien's jaw was tight. "I thought it was a bluff. I didn't think she'd actually—" "You didn't read it carefully." "I didn't think I needed to." Gerald nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are not agreeing with you but have simply run out of anything useful to say. That was how they had returned to the courtroom. Damien walking back in with his spine still straight, his chin still up, doing the thing he had done his entire life when reality presented him with something he didn't want, pushing forward and deciding he would manage it. He was good at managing things. He had always been good at managing things. He had sat back down at his table and straightened his tie and looked at Vanessa in the gallery with an expression meant to communicate that everything was fine. She had not looked entirely convinced, and now Patricia Okafor was standing in front of the room with Exhibit 31A, and the judge had just asked Damien Cross whether he was aware that the transfer had never been reversed. And Gerald's hand was on his arm saying, "Don't answer that. Don't answer that," in a low murmur, and Damien was doing the calculation that men like him always did. The calculation of how much he could still control, how much of this he could still shape into something survivable. The calculation was not going well. Judge Harper set the document down and looked out at the courtroom over her reading glasses. She was not a theatrical person. In 19 years on the bench, she had made a point of not performing her authority. She didn't need to. It was simply there, settled into her, the way long experience settles into people who have paid attention to it. But there was something in her face right now that the older woman in the back row, the one who had come for her own quiet disaster, recognized immediately. It was the look of someone who has just confirmed something they suspected. "Ms. Okafor," Judge Harper said, "walk me through the timeline." Patricia was prepared for this. She had been prepared for this for 6 weeks, which was how long she had known that this moment was coming, and had spent building the architecture of it, laying each piece in the right order, the way Claire had once laid out the architecture of rooms, methodically, with attention to how things would feel when you finally stood inside them. She began. The Harmon lawsuit, 2016. The advice from counsel. Gerald Fitch's own advice, documented in his billing records, to transfer controlling ownership to a spouse as temporary asset protection. The transfer executed in October 2016, signed by Damien, notarized, filed with the state. The reversal paperwork sent and ignored in early 2017. And this was the part that landed in the room like something physical. Claire's certified letter of September 2017, sent to the Cross Holdings corporate address and to Damien's personal attorney, formally notifying both parties that she intended to retain the ownership interest as permanent. The letter was received and signed for, Patricia said, and she held up the green return receipt card the way you hold up evidence that cannot be argued with, by a member of Mr. Cross's personal staff. Gerald Fitch was writing on his legal pad now, fast. The handwriting of a man doing math he doesn't like. At no point, Patricia continued, in the 7 years since that letter was sent, did Mr. Cross take any legal action to contest or reverse the transfer. He did not file a challenge. He did not pursue arbitration. He continued to operate Cross Holdings as its public-facing CEO, while his wife legally held controlling interest. She paused to let that sit. In effect, he has been running a company that did not legally belong to him. From the gallery, someone made a small sound. Not loud, just a short exhale, the involuntary kind. Damien's head turned very slightly toward Gerald, just a degree or two, a private language between two men who had known each other a long time. Gerald gave the smallest shake of his head, which meant there is nothing left to argue. Claire was aware that people were looking at her. She had been aware of it all day, in the way that you are aware of weather, peripheral, constant, something you register without turning to face. People looked at divorcing women a certain way in these rooms. There was always a script they assigned you before you opened your mouth. The wronged wife, the bitter wife, the desperate wife, the wife who doesn't know how bad it's going to get. She had walked into rooms like this before. Not courtrooms, but rooms where power was being divided, and she knew the look. What she felt right now, sitting at that table while Patricia laid out 7 years of legal reality, was not triumph. She wanted to be honest with herself about that, at least. There was something that wasn't quite triumph, something more complicated. The way it feels when a thing you've been carrying for a long time is finally not fixed, not healed, but over. The particular exhaustion and lightness of an ending. She thought briefly of the woman she had been at 31. Standing in a gutted brownstone in Carroll Gardens with paint on her jeans and a measuring tape in her pocket, sketching out what a wall could become. She had loved that. The pure problem of a space, its limitations, its potential, the way you could look at something broken and see the shape of what it wanted to be. She wondered when exactly she had stopped trusting that part of herself. Damien had not taken it from her all at once. That was the thing that people didn't understand about how these things happened. It was gradual. It was 100 small moments spread over 20 years. A joke at a dinner party where he described her as my decorator, a business meeting she wasn't invited to, a profile in a magazine where her name appeared in a single sentence at the end of a long paragraph about his vision. Each one small enough to dismiss. Each one, looking back, a brick in a wall that eventually stood between her and the version of herself she'd started with. She had told herself she didn't mind. For a long time, she had almost convinced herself. Mrs. Bennet. She came back to the room. Patricia was looking at her. They want a recess for 30 minutes, Patricia said quietly. Gerald Fitch has requested time to confer with his client. Claire nodded. Patricia leaned in closer. How are you holding up? Claire looked at her hands on the table. Her wedding ring was still there. She hadn't taken it off yet. She wasn't sure why she hadn't. Some instinct about finishing things properly, about not celebrating until the last thing was done. I'm fine, she said again. And then, because Patricia deserved a more honest answer, ask me in an hour. Damien and Gerald found a room. It was not the same conference room as before. This one was smaller, at the end of a hallway, with a window that looked out onto a brick wall and a fire escape. Damien stood at that window with his back to Gerald for almost a full minute before he spoke. Is there anything, he said. Anything at all? Damien, just tell me if there's anything. Gerald sat down. He put his folder on the table and folded his hands on top of it with the manner of someone who has been in this profession long enough to know when the fighting part is over. The transfer is legal, he said. It was properly executed and properly filed. She notified you of her intent to retain. You took no action. Under New York law. I know what it means under New York law. Damien turned from the window. His face was different now than it had been this morning. The morning face, confident, slightly contemptuous, already in the restaurant at Per Se, was gone. What was underneath it was something older and less certain. I'm asking you if there is anything. She would have to agree to transfer it back, Gerald said, voluntarily. or you would need to demonstrate fraud or coercion in the original transfer, which, he stopped himself, which is not a viable argument, given that the transfer was your own attorney's recommendation and executed with your full cooperation. A long silence. What does she want? Damien said. I expect we're going to find out. She wants money. She wants the settlement. She wants... Damien. Gerald's voice was patient in the way that's not really patience, but something beyond it, some state-past patience. She already has the company. She doesn't need a settlement. She owns controlling interest in Cross Holdings and every subsidiary under it. The question is not what she'll accept in lieu of the company. The question is what happens to you. Damien stood very still. What happens to me? He repeated. Your employment agreement with Cross Holdings expires in 14 months, Gerald said. As controlling owner, she has the legal right not to renew it. She could retain you in an operational role if she chooses, or she doesn't have to. He paused. That's a decision she gets to make. The fire escape outside the window rattled faintly in the wind. She wouldn't, Damien said, but his voice didn't carry it the way it would have this morning. Gerald said nothing. Gerald, she built that company with me. Whatever she says about designs, and she built that company with me. She's not going to... She spent 7 years watching you run a company that legally belonged to her, Gerald said quietly. She watched you take a mistress and walk into this courtroom with a bottle of champagne. She watched you publicly refer to her as supportive staff in a Forbes profile 2 years ago. He looked at Damien steadily. I would not assume I know what she will or won't do. Damien sat down. It was not a graceful thing. It was the sitting down of a man whose legs have just decided they are done holding him up. He put his elbows on the table and pressed his hands over his face, and for a moment he was not the billionaire developer, not the self-made king, not the man whose name was on 12 buildings. He was just a man in a small room off a courthouse hallway, trying to understand how he had arrived here. He had made a mistake. He understood that now with a clarity he hadn't had this morning. Not the mistake of the transfer, though that was catastrophic, but a different one, the older one, the one that had been accumulating for 20 years. He had looked at Claire Bennett every day for 2 decades and seen only what he needed her to be. He had never once looked carefully enough to see what she actually was. Vanessa was in the hallway when Damien came out. She was standing near a window with her arms crossed and her purse over her shoulder, and when she saw him she straightened up slightly. She had reapplied her lipstick at some point. That detail registered somewhere in Damien's awareness without meaning anything to him right now. Well, she said. He looked at her. He took in the question, the expectation behind it, the assumption that he was going to tell her it was handled, and something shifted in him, something that might have been honesty, finally arriving a couple of decades too late. It's not fine, he said. She stared at him. What do you mean it's not fine? Gerald said what I wanted to hear for too long. He was already moving past her toward the courtroom doors. You should think about getting your own attorney. She grabbed his arm. Damien, what is happening? What does that mean? What? He stopped. He looked at her hand on his arm and then at her face, and there was something in his expression that was not the commanding look she was used to, and not anger either, something hollower than either of those. It means, he said, that I've been running someone else's company for 7 years and I didn't know it. He went back into the courtroom. Vanessa stood in the hallway for a long moment. The fluorescent lights hummed above her. Down the hall, a door opened and 2 court officers walked by talking about lunch. An ordinary afternoon in an ordinary building, while somewhere inside it, something enormous was about to be made official. She thought about what Claire had said in the bathroom. Whatever you've been told about what he owns, you might want to spend this afternoon paying attention. She had thought it was a threat. The kind of thing a bitter woman says to the younger woman. She understood now that it was something else entirely. It was a warning, and it had been accurate. She took a breath, hitched her purse higher on her shoulder, and went back to her seat in the gallery because she didn't know what else to do, and because some part of her still needed to watch how this ended. The afternoon session reconvened. Claire returned to her seat. Patricia set a fresh glass of water on the table in front of her, and Claire wrapped both hands around it and looked straight ahead at the bench, while Judge Harper settled in and shuffled through the documents one more time. The light through the high windows had shifted while they were in recess. Earlier it had been that sharp midday white. Now it had softened into the beginning of afternoon, the kind of light that makes everything look slightly more real than it did before. Gerald Fitch stood and made one final argument. It was not a strong argument. It was the argument of a man who is very good at his job and has been dealt unworkable cards and is playing them anyway out of obligation. He spoke about the spirit of the original transfer, about intent, about the reasonable expectations of a business partnership within a marriage. It was measured and precise, and it didn't matter at all. When he sat down, Judge Harper looked at the documents in front of her one last time. She looked at Damian Cross. "Mr. Cross," she said, "you are a man who built a significant enterprise. I don't dispute that. But you are also a man who stopped paying attention to details when you decided the rules that applied to other people did not apply to you." She let that sit for exactly as long as it needed to. "The law does not make exceptions for people who find paperwork inconvenient." Damian said nothing. The judge looked back down at her papers. "I'm ready to deliver my ruling." Claire's hands tightened slightly around the water glass. Not from fear. From the particular feeling of standing at the edge of a very long drop and finally being ready to step off. Outside, somewhere beyond the high courthouse windows, the city went about its afternoon the way cities do. Indifferent, relentless, entirely unaware that in one room in one building, a woman who had spent 20 years being quietly erased was about to be handed back everything she had built. And she sat there, still and straight, and waited for it. Judge Evelyn Harper did not rush. That was the thing Claire would remember later, in the strange, quiet days that followed. Not the verdict itself, but the pace of it. The deliberate, unhurried way the judge moved through her ruling, as if she understood that some things needed to be said at full weight, without compression, without the courtesy of brevity that powerful men had always extended to one another in rooms like this. So began with the facts, because she was a person who believed facts deserved to be spoken aloud before conclusions were drawn from them. She went through the financial record, Claire's initial investment in 2001, the $91,000 drawn from a personal savings account built over years before she'd ever met Damian Cross. She cited Dorothy Reyes's testimony without embellishment. She cited the bank records. She noted that Cross Holdings' first 3 projects, the ones that established the company's reputation and made the larger contracts possible, had been funded entirely by Claire's capital. Damian sat very still through this part. Then the judge moved to the creative record, and this was the part that was harder to quantify, and therefore the part that had required more care. Thomas Ellery's testimony. 3 other former employees who had submitted written depositions, people Patricia had found and prepared over 6 careful weeks, all describing the same pattern. The designs were Claire's. The vision was Claire's. The thing that made wealthy buyers on the Upper West Side choose Cross over every other contractor operating in that market in 2002 and 2003 was not Damian's negotiating ability. It was the way a room felt when Claire Bennett had decided what it should become. The court recognizes, Judge Harper said, that creative contribution in the context of a marital business partnership is not always easy to document. People work in proximity, influence each other, build things together in ways that resist clean division. She paused. However, in this case, the testimony is consistent and the documentary record is clear. Mrs. Bennett was not a supportive spouse. She was a founding architect of this enterprise in every meaningful sense of the word. Claire looked down at the table. She had not expected that sentence to hit her the way it did. She had been prepared for the legal ruling. Patricia had walked her through every likely outcome with the thoroughness of someone who didn't believe in surprises. But she had not been entirely prepared for the feeling of hearing a stranger in a position of authority. Say plainly, in a room full of people, the thing that had been true for 22 years and never once said out loud in her presence. She blinked, once. Then she put her hands flat on the table and kept her face steady. Patricia, beside her, said nothing. She just put one hand briefly over Claire's and then moved it away. A small practical gesture of acknowledgement. Then the judge came to the ownership question, and the room got very quiet in a different way. She walked through the 2016 transfer with precision, the legal validity of the document, the proper execution, the filing, the notification letter of 2017, the green certified mail receipt. She noted that Mr. Cross had been represented by counsel throughout this period, and that his failure to execute the reversal paperwork could not be attributed to a lack of legal resources or guidance. Mr. Cross, she said, looking directly at him, I've been on this bench for 19 years. In that time, I have seen people make genuine mistakes with legal documents. People who were confused, who lacked resources, who were misled by counsel they trusted. That is not what I see here. Her voice did not rise. It It didn't need to. What I see here is a man who received clear notification of a significant legal circumstance and chose not to take it seriously because he was accustomed to operating in an environment where consequences applied to other people. She let one beat of silence pass. That is not a mistake. That is a choice. And choices have outcomes. In the gallery, someone coughed. Gerald Fitch was writing on his legal pad again, fast, though there was nothing useful left to write. Damien's face had gone a particular color. Not red, not pale, but the complicated undertone of both at once, the color of a man whose body is experiencing something his mind is still refusing. The court therefore finds, Judge Harper said, that the transfer of controlling ownership of Cross Holdings LLC and all subsidiary entities to Claire Marie Bennett, executed in October 2016, is valid, legally binding, and permanent. She turned the page in front of her. Mrs. Bennett is confirmed as the sole controlling owner of all assets held under the Cross Holdings corporate structure, including but not limited to all real property, operating accounts, subsidiary LLCs, and intellectual property. She looked up. Mr. Cross, you retain your personal assets accumulated outside the corporate structure, which your financial disclosure places at approximately $4.3 million. You retain your personal residence on Park Avenue, which is held in your name personally and is not part of the corporate estate. She paused, and something in her expression shifted, not softer exactly, but more considered. You are a man of substantial personal means by any ordinary standard. I say that not to minimize the significance of this ruling, but to be precise about what it does and does not take from you. Another pause. What it takes is the company. What it returns is a legal reality that has existed for 7 years. Then she said the line that would get repeated in every news story about the case for the next 4 months. It all belongs to her. It always has. The sound that came out of Damien Cross in that moment was not loud. It wasn't a shout or a sob or any of the dramatic things a person might expect. It was something smaller and stranger. A short, compressed exhale, like a man who has just been hit somewhere soft and is trying not to show it. His shoulders came forward slightly. His hands, which had been flat on the table, curled inward. Gerald put a hand on his arm. Damien didn't seem to feel it. Behind them, in the gallery, the reaction was less contained. The 2 court reporters who'd been tipped off and arrived just after the morning recess were already on their phones. The older woman in the back row had her hand pressed over her mouth. 3 other attorneys who'd stayed past their own hearings were exchanging looks with the particular electricity of people who have just witnessed something they are going to be describing at dinner for years. And Vanessa Hale sat in her seat in the gallery and did not move. She was looking at the back of Damien's head. She had spent the last 8 months looking at Damien from various angles, in various lights, in the way that people look at someone when they are deciding what kind of future they are building. She had thought she knew what she was looking at. She had thought she was looking at a man with a foundation under him. She understood now that she had been looking at a performance, an extraordinarily well-maintained, extremely convincing performance, backed by assets that had not, in any legal sense, belonged to the performer. She picked up her purse from the floor. She stood. She did not say anything to anyone. She walked to the end of the row, stepped into the aisle, and moved toward the exit with the careful, deliberate pace of someone trying very hard to look like they are not leaving in a hurry. The door closed behind her. Damien didn't turn around. Outside in the corridor, Vanessa walked until she found a bench near the elevator bank and sat down. She set her purse in her lap and stared at the elevator doors. She was 29 years old, and she had a lease on an apartment in Tribeca that Damien paid for, and a car that Damien leased, and a credit card attached to a Cross Holdings corporate account. She had the outline of a life built on an assumption that had just been ruled officially to be wrong. She thought about calling her mother, and then thought about what her mother would say, and decided against it. Not yet. She sat there for a few minutes, doing the arithmetic of her situation. It was not comfortable arithmetic. She thought about what Claire had said in the bathroom. You should think about that. And the thing was, she hadn't. Not really. She had told herself that whatever had happened in that marriage, whatever Damien had done or not done, was the business of 2 people she didn't fully know. She had constructed a version of herself in this situation that was separate from the damage of it. That had been easier before today. She was still sitting there when a young woman from one of the news crews came around the corner with a camera operator behind her and stopped when she saw Vanessa. "Excuse me, are you Vanessa Hale?" Were you in the cross hearing this morning? Vanessa looked at her for a long moment. No comment, she said. She stood, walked to the elevator, and pressed the button. Back in the courtroom, the scene was slower to settle. Judge Harper had moved on. She had other cases, other disasters, other rooms full of people who needed the law to sort out what they couldn't sort out themselves. She signed the final order, handed it to her clerk, gave Damien one last look that contained within it the full weight of everything she hadn't said, and left through the side door. The room filled immediately with the sound of movement, people standing, gathering papers, the low, urgent murmur of attorneys speaking to clients. Gerald crouched next to Damien's chair. Damien had not stood up yet. I need you to hear me right now, Gerald said. I know. But there are reporters in the hall, and we need to leave this building without you saying anything to anyone. Do you understand me? Damien was looking at the table, at the surface of it, at nothing. Damien. She was always going to do this, Damien said. His voice was quiet and strange. All those years. She was just waiting. Gerald pressed his lips together. He had known Damien Cross for 15 years. He had watched him build things. He had watched him be ruthless and careless and occasionally brilliant. He was not without sympathy for him. He was a human being, and this was a catastrophic day. But he was also a man who had sent the reversal paperwork twice and been ignored twice, and there was a limit to what he could offer here. We need to go, he said. She sat in that marriage for... How long did she know? Did she know when she sent the letter? Did she already know she was going to... Damien, Gerald's voice firmed up. I cannot answer those questions today. What I can do is get you out of this building. Stand up. A long beat. Damien Cross pushed back his chair and stood. He looked, for the first time since Claire had known him, like a man his actual age. The easy authority was gone. Not hidden, not suppressed, but genuinely gone, like something that had required a certain kind of certainty to run on and had simply stopped working when the certainty ran out. He straightened his jacket out of habit. His hands were steady. He was still presenting himself with the ingrained discipline of a man who had never once allowed himself to look uncertain in public. But his eyes, when they moved across the courtroom toward the door, passed over Claire Bennett's chair. She was still sitting there. Patricia was beside her, speaking quietly, sorting documents. Claire was listening and nodding in the small, precise way she nodded when she was processing something. She hadn't looked up. Damien stopped for 1 second. 1 second where he was simply standing there looking at the back of her head. The profile of her, the navy coat, the way she held herself straight with that particular posture that he had stopped noticing years ago, the way you stop noticing furniture. He thought about the brownstone in Carroll Gardens, 2002. They had gone together to look at the gutted shell of the place before they bought it, before they had any real money, and Claire had stood in the middle of what would become the main room with her tape measure and her sketchbook, and she had been practically vibrating with the idea of it. She had been so sure. She had grabbed his arm and said, "Look, Damien, look at what this could be," and he had looked. And the truth was that he hadn't quite seen it the way she saw it. He had believed her, though. He had borrowed money on the strength of her certainty. He had borrowed more than that, in the end. And then he had forgotten he'd done it. He kept walking. Gerald was at his elbow. The doors opened. The hallway was in fact full of reporters, and Gerald got them through with a firm hand and 2 words. No comment. No comment. And they made it to the elevator, and then to the lobby, and then to the car that was waiting. And through all of it, Damien said nothing. Claire let the room clear before she stood. Patricia had learned, over the course of the 6 weeks they'd worked together, that Claire operated on her own internal timeline, and that trying to rush it was counterproductive. She waited. She organized her documents with the neat efficiency that was her natural mode, and she waited. When the last of the gallery had filtered out and the court officers were doing their end-of-session rounds, Claire finally pushed back her chair. She stood by the table for a moment. Patricia looked at her. "You okay?" Patricia said. She had stopped asking with the formal attorney distance by week 2. It hadn't been necessary. "I don't know what I am," Claire said honestly. That surprised Patricia, just slightly. In 6 weeks, Claire had been measured, prepared, occasionally dry-humored, never sentimental. This was the first crack of something less composed, and it was so brief that most people would have missed it. "That's probably the right answer," Patricia said. Claire looked around the courtroom, at the bench where the judge had sat, at the chairs, at the high windows where the afternoon light was now fully gold, slanting in at the angle it reached around 4 o'clock. It was an ordinary room. Fluorescent fixtures and municipal carpeting and the accumulated weight of every difficult thing that had been decided inside it. Nothing about it was beautiful. She thought about what it meant to own a company. Not the abstraction of it. She'd understood the legal reality for 7 years. But the actual, physical, day-to-day reality of walking into Cross Holdings on Monday morning with a court order in her attorney's files and her name on everything and 22 years of being quietly erased now, officially, corrected. She wasn't sure she was ready for it. She wasn't sure it mattered whether she was ready. "I have to call my sister," she said. "Of course." Patricia gathered the last of her folders. "Take your time." Claire pulled out her phone. She had 3 missed calls, 2 from her sister Margaret, 1 from a number she didn't recognize that was probably a reporter. She ignored the unknown number and pressed Margaret's contact. It rang twice. "Claire." Margaret's voice was tight with the controlled tension of someone who had been waiting and trying not to catastrophize. She was 61 and had been Claire's closest person since their mother died, and she had sat in this kind of fear before. "What happened? Tell me." Claire stood in the emptying courtroom and looked at the light in the high windows. "It's done," she said. A silence. Then, "And?" "And it went the way Patricia said it would." Another silence, longer this time. And then Margaret made a sound that was not quite a word. Something raw and unpolished, the sound of relief arriving after a long time of not being allowed to. Claire heard her breathing on the other end of the line and felt the thing in her own chest that she hadn't been able to name all day finally shift, finally move, finally begin to release into something she might eventually be able to call okay. "Come home," Margaret said. "Come to my place. I made dinner. I made too much. I've been stress cooking since 9 this morning." Claire almost laughed. It came out as something between a laugh and a shaky exhale. "I'll be there by 7, she said. She hung up. Patricia was at the door, holding it open, giving her space and time in the generous, unspoken way of someone who understood that some endings needed a moment of stillness before the next thing began. Claire looked around the courtroom one last time. She thought about Damien walking out, the split second when she'd felt, in her peripheral vision, him stop and look at her before he left. She hadn't turned to meet it. She hadn't wanted to. Not because she was angry. The anger had burned out years ago and left something cooler and more permanent in its place, but because there was nothing left in that direction worth looking at. Everything worth looking at was ahead of her. She picked up her bag, straightened the navy coat, and walked toward the door where Patricia was waiting. Her heels were steady on the municipal carpet. Her hands weren't shaking. Outside in the hallway, she could hear the faint commotion of the reporters who hadn't been able to follow Gerald and Damien fast enough, now repositioning themselves near the exits. She paused at the doorway. "How many of them are out there?" she said. Patricia glanced through the small window in the door. 7, maybe 8. Claire nodded. She thought for a moment about the woman she had been this morning, sitting at that table while Damien poured champagne, holding herself perfectly still, waiting. And about the woman she had been 23 years ago in that gutted brownstone, tape measure in hand, so certain of what a ruined space could become. She had been right then, and she had been right to wait. "All right," she said, and she pushed open the door. The story broke at 11:47 that night. Not a small story. Not the kind of item that appears in the back pages of a business section and gets forwarded around by people in real estate circles. A full front-page digital lead on 3 major outlets simultaneously, with the headline variations cycling through different emphases. Billionaire developer loses empire to wife in stunning court ruling, and judge awards entire Cross Holdings to founder's wife. It all belongs to her. And the one that got shared the most, the one that was up to 40,000 shares by 2 in the morning. He came to court with champagne and his mistress. He left with nothing. Someone in the courthouse had talked. Several someones, probably. By midnight there were photographs. Not from inside the courtroom, where cameras were prohibited, but from the hallway outside, grainy phone images of Damien walking with his jacket slightly wrong and Gerald's hand on his arm, and one image of Vanessa leaving alone through a side exit, her face turned away, which somehow communicated everything without showing anything. Claire's phone, which she had silenced before dinner at Margaret's apartment, had 46 notifications by the time she turned it back on at 10:30 that night. She was sitting at Margaret's kitchen table with a cup of tea that had gone cold while she was reading, and Margaret was across from her in the worn flannel shirt she wore on weekends. Watching her sister's face with the careful attention of someone who has been watching someone they love navigate a long and difficult thing and is trying to gauge, now that the difficult thing is over, whether the person is actually okay or just performing okay. How bad is it? Margaret said. It's not bad, Claire said, still scrolling. It's just a lot. Are you being interviewed? Are there reporters outside my building? Not yours. Claire put the phone face down on the table. Mine, probably. Patricia texted. She says, don't answer anything, don't post anything, don't basically just go dark for 48 hours. Smart woman. She's the smartest person I've worked with in years. Claire picked up the cold tea, realized it was cold, set it back down. She said the offers will start coming in tomorrow. People who want to talk about the case. Television. Margaret raised her eyebrows. Are you going to do it? Claire was quiet for a moment. The kitchen smelled like the chicken and roasted vegetables. Margaret had stress cooked all day, and there was a particular comfort in being in this kitchen. She had been in it since Margaret bought the apartment in 1998, had sat at the same table through her mother's illness and her own wedding preparations, and the one bad year in 2019 when she had sat here and told Margaret, for the first time, that her marriage was not what it looked like from the outside. Margaret had sat exactly where she was sitting right now, and had not said "I told you so," which had taken considerable restraint given that she had, in fact, told her so. In 2009, and again in 2014. I don't know yet, Claire said. You don't have to decide tonight. I know. Margaret leaned forward and refilled Claire's cup from the kettle she'd left nearby. Are you going to sleep? Claire looked at the steam rising from the fresh tea. She thought about her apartment, the Upper East Side place she'd moved to after she and Damien separated, the one she'd chosen carefully and furnished slowly, and which had become, in the past 18 months, the first space in a long time that felt entirely like herself. She thought about walking in there tonight, alone, with 46 notifications and a court order and 22 years of marriage officially concluded. Probably not much, she said honestly. Then stay here. It wasn't a question. Claire looked at her sister and felt something she didn't have a word for, the specific gratitude of being known well enough that someone doesn't wait for you to ask. All right, she said. Damien's apartment was 41 floors above Park Avenue, and at 2 in the morning it was very quiet and very large. In the way that apartments are large when the people who were supposed to fill them are gone. He was sitting in the study, not drinking. He'd thought about it and then decided against it because he was 54 years old, and he'd watched what drinking in the dark after catastrophe did to men his age, and he had too much self-preservation left to go down that road. I was just sitting. In the leather chair by the window that looked north toward the park, in the dark, with his phone on the side table where he'd put it after reading the third news story and deciding he was done reading. Gerald had called at midnight. He'd let it go to voicemail. Gerald had texted shortly after. Call me tomorrow morning. We need to talk about your transition options. Try to sleep. The try to sleep had a quality of professional obligation about it. Gerald was not a man who gave emotional advice, but he understood that you had to append something human to a text like that. Damien was not going to try to sleep. He knew the shape of this night. He'd had bad nights before. Business disasters, the Harmon lawsuit, the year in 2009 when 3 projects had stalled simultaneously, and he genuinely thought the whole structure was going to come down. I knew the particular quality of 3 in the morning when something has gone wrong and your brain won't stop running the scenario backward, finding every point where a different decision would have changed everything. The difference tonight was that he kept arriving at the same point. 2017. The certified letter. The green return receipt card that his assistant had signed for and placed on his desk, and that he now remembered clearly, actually picked up, had held in his hand, had read the return address. Bennett, it said, with the name of her attorney's office, and had set it down on the stack of things he'd decided were not urgent, the stack that lived on the corner of the desk and that his assistant cleared every Friday afternoon. He had known what it was. He hadn't needed to open it to know what it was. Claire was sending legal correspondence about the transfer. It was paperwork. It was her being thorough. It was the kind of thing lawyers sent back and forth, and that meant nothing in the actual operation of power. He had been the CEO of Cross Holdings. He had been in the magazines. He had been the man with his name on the buildings. He had believed, with the certainty so complete it had never once required examination, that whatever Claire put her name to on paper, The actual substance of the world belonged to him. He sat in the dark with that understanding, and he did not look away from it. Whatever else he had never been a man who found comfort in lying to himself, and he was not going to start now. He had made the assumption. He had held it for 7 years. And the assumption had been, in the most fundamental legal sense possible, wrong. At 3:15 his phone lit up with a text he hadn't expected. It was from Vanessa. I moved my things out this afternoon while you were still in the meeting with Gerald. The key is with the doorman. I'm sorry about how all of this went. I mean that. He read it twice. He thought about responding for a while. I thought about what he would say. What was true versus what was gracious versus what was simply the kind of thing you say when someone you've been with for 8 months sends you a message like that at 3 in the morning. None of the options felt quite right. He set the phone down. He looked at the window, at the lights of the city going north, at the particular permanence of New York at night, all those lit windows, all those other people in their own versions of their own hours. I thought about something Gerald had said during the recess, something he'd almost missed in the noise of everything else. She spent 7 years watching you run a company that legally belonged to her. And the thing was, Damien had turned that sentence over now from enough angles to see what it actually meant. Claire hadn't been waiting in the way he'd told himself in the courtroom, the way that made her into a schemer, a patient predator. He didn't actually believe that. He had said it because it was easier than the alternative. The alternative was that she had spent 7 years living with a man who had stopped seeing her, raising no alarm, doing nothing dramatic, simply holding a legal reality in her name like a quiet fact she didn't need to announce. Not plotting, just keeping it. Keeping the truth of what she had built, in the one form that couldn't be taken from her. That was not scheming. That was something else entirely. That was the behavior of a woman who had learned not to trust words and had decided to trust documents instead. He closed his eyes. The Cross Holdings offices were on the 32nd floor of a building in Midtown, and at 9 the next morning the lobby was dealing with 3 journalists and a camera crew who had positioned themselves near the revolving doors and were attempting to ask questions of everyone who worked there. The building's security was handling it with the polished indifference of people who dealt with celebrity complications on a regular basis, and most of the Cross Holdings staff made it through the lobby without stopping. Most. Marcus Webb, who had been Damien's director of operations for 9 years, stopped just inside the revolving door and took in the scene. He was 53, had been in commercial real estate his entire adult life, and was not by nature an excitable person. But he stood in that lobby for a moment with his coffee cup in his hand, and he did the quick, professional calculation of what it meant that there were 3 news cameras outside the building where he worked. He got in the elevator and took out his phone and called the one person he thought could tell him what was actually happening. It rang 4 times. Then, Marcus. Patricia Okafor, he said. He had met her twice, at events, and had her number from a professional networking dinner 2 years ago. Tell me if I'm calling the wrong person right now. A pause. What do you need to know? I need to know what happened to the company I've worked at for 9 years. Another pause, longer this time. Then Patricia said, The ruling stands. Cross Holdings belongs to Claire Bennett, effective as of the court order filed yesterday afternoon. I'd expect her to be in contact with senior staff within 48 hours. Marcus stood in the elevator as it rose. And Cross? Damien? Mr. Cross's operational role going forward is a matter for Mrs. Bennett to determine. The elevator stopped at 32. The doors opened onto the Cross Holdings reception area, which looked exactly as it always did. The sleek desk, the logo on the wall, the floor-to-ceiling windows with the Midtown view, and yet had the quality of a stage set, suddenly, in a way it had never had before, as if the thing that gave it its meaning had shifted overnight, and the furniture hadn't caught up yet. All right, Marcus said, thank you. He hung up. He walked through reception. His assistant looked up at him with an expression that was trying very hard to be normal and not quite making it. Any word from... She started. Not yet, Marcus said. Hold everything non-essential. I need an hour. He went into his office and closed the door. He sat at his desk and looked at the wall across from him, which had a framed architectural rendering of the Riverside project, the biggest thing Cross Holdings had done in the last 3 years. Claire Bennett had not been involved in that project, officially. Officially, she had been, what? A consulting creative was how Damien had described her contribution in the project meetings. An occasional voice. A courtesy inclusion. Marcus thought about that rendering for a long moment. He thought about the meeting 4 years ago, where they had been stuck on the lobby design. 3 rounds of revisions, the developer client unhappy, the project architect defensive, the whole thing going sideways. And Claire had come in for what was supposed to be a 20-minute walkthrough and had stood in front of the floor plan for approximately 90 seconds before saying very quietly, "The problem is the entrance sequence. You're asking people to arrive before the building is ready to receive them," and had taken a pen and moved 2 walls on the drawing with 4 lines. And the room had gone completely silent because she was right, and everyone in it knew she was right instantly. He had filed that memory under useful creative input and moved on. He was refiling it now. Claire arrived at Patricia's office at 9:30, which was the only meeting she had agreed to that day. She had slept, finally, around 5 in the morning in Margaret's guest room under the quilt that had been in their family since her grandmother made it, and had woken at 8 feeling the specific grogginess of too little sleep and the specific clarity of something being over. She had borrowed Margaret's face wash and borrowed a scarf from Margaret's closet, and had drunk 2 cups of coffee at the kitchen table, while Margaret talked determinedly about other things, her garden, her book club, a neighbor's inexplicable decision to repaint their door. Bright orange. And Claire had let herself be surrounded by the ordinary warmth of it before the day came in. The day was coming in now. Patricia's office was in a building on Lexington, small and deliberately understated. She had told Claire once that clients in crisis needed to feel like they were in a place of stability, not a place that was trying to impress them. There were plants. Real ones, imperfectly maintained, which Claire had noticed on her first visit and found oddly reassuring. Patricia had coffee waiting and the look of someone who had been up early and had already done a significant amount of thinking. "You've seen the coverage," Patricia said. "Enough of it. It's going to intensify today. There are 2 morning show producers who have already reached out, and—" Patricia paused. "Damien's PR team issued a statement at 7 this morning." Claire looked at her. "What does it say?" Patricia pulled up her phone and read it aloud. It was, in the way of corporate PR statements, technically factual and emotionally evasive. It acknowledged the court ruling, described it as a legal matter resolved through the judicial process, said that Damien Cross had full respect for the court's decision, and expressed his continuing commitment to the New York real estate community. It said nothing about Claire, it said nothing about the company. It ended with a line about looking forward to the next chapter. Claire sat with that for a moment. "He's already positioning," she said. "Yes. That's fine." She set down her coffee cup. "Let him position. What do I need to do today?" Patricia had a list. Of course she had a list. The list included notifications to Cross Holdings Board, a small board of 3 independent directors who had been appointed when the company took on outside investors 6 years ago, and who had, Patricia said, received a copy of the court order at 8 that morning, along with a letter from Patricia's firm. It included a conversation with the company's primary bank. It included a review of all active contracts to identify anything that required the controlling owner's signature. And it included a decision about Marcus Webb and the senior operations team, when to contact them, what to say, how to handle the first days of what was effectively a transfer of operational control. Claire listened to all of it. She asked precise questions. She took the notes Patricia offered and added her own in the margins. Then she said, "What's your honest assessment of the company's condition? Not legally, operationally." Patricia leaned back in her chair slightly. "That's outside my expertise specifically, but from the financial documents we reviewed, it's sound. Some of the smaller suburban projects have been underperforming, but the core New York portfolio is healthy. The people running the day-to-day are good at their jobs." She paused. "Marcus Webb in particular has a strong reputation." Claire nodded slowly. She was quiet for a moment in the way she got quiet when she was looking at a floor plan, processing something spatially, seeing what was there and what wasn't, imagining what it wanted to become. "I want to call Marcus myself," she said. "Not a letter from your office. Me, directly." Patricia nodded. "That's your call to make." "And the board meeting? I want it this week, not next week. This week, while the news cycle is still loud, because that's actually better than letting it sit. People fill silence with assumption." Patricia looked at her with the expression she sometimes got, not quite surprise, more like recognition. Like she was seeing, in these moments, the person who had built half an empire and been written out of the story and was now watching her walk back into it. "I'll set it for Thursday," Patricia said. "Good." Claire stood. She picked up her notes, put on the navy coat she'd brought in over her arm. She was wearing different clothes today, not the careful, composed armor of yesterday, but something simpler. Dark trousers, a cream blouse, boots. The clothes of a person going to work, not a person walking into a battle. She stopped at the door. "Patricia," she said. "Yeah. I haven't said this properly. You did extraordinary work, 6 weeks of extraordinary work, and you never made me feel like a client with a problem. You made me feel like a person with a case, but—" She looked at her directly. "Thank you." Patricia was not a demonstrative person, but something in her face shifted into genuine warmth briefly, before the professional composure reasserted itself. "You did the hard part," Patricia said. 7 years of hard part, before I was ever involved." Claire smiled, small, real, the kind that reaches the eyes, and went through the door. She called Marcus Webb from the back of the car heading cross town. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he'd been waiting for the call. She had always liked that about people who answered quickly. They were either very busy or very direct, and either was preferable to the kind of person who let things go to voicemail on purpose to seem important. "Mrs. Bennett," he said. Marcus. She had met him at a company events over the years. In the peripheral way she had existed at Cross Holdings for the last decade, present enough to be recognized, absent enough to be safely ignored. "I want to be straightforward with you, because I think that's the most useful thing I can be right now." "I'd appreciate that," he said. "I'm not coming in to clean house. I don't have a list of people to remove or an organizational chart I've been building in secret. What I have is 22 years of knowing what this company is and what it should be." She paused. "What I need from you is an honest picture of where it actually stands. Not what was presented to investors. What you see from where you sit." A short silence. She could hear him breathing, the careful breath of someone deciding how honest to be, running the calculation of what this moment required. "When can we meet?" he said. "Tomorrow," she said. "Your office." Another beat. "Then, I'll have the operational reports pulled." "The real ones," she said, "not the presentation versions." The smallest pause. Then something that was almost a laugh. Not quite, but close. The sound of a man who had been working with presentation versions for 9 years and had someone just name it plainly for the first time. "The real ones," he agreed. She hung up and looked out the window at the city going past. Midtown in the morning, deliveries and pedestrians, and the particular forward momentum of a place that does not pause for anyone's private reckoning. She was 50 years old. She had spent the first half of her adult life building something, and the second half watching someone else take credit for it. She had been patient in ways that had cost her, had been quiet in ways she was only now understanding, had not been wisdom, but a kind of grief. The grief of a person who has swallowed their own history so many times it has become hard to locate. She was done with that. Not angry. She had been angry in the years before, and it had exhausted her and changed nothing. This was different. This was the specific clarity of a woman who has stopped waiting to be given back what was taken and has simply reached out and taken it herself through the only means that had ever actually worked: patience, documentation, and the refusal to sign anything she didn't mean. The car moved east. The city opened up ahead of her. She had a company to run. Marcus Webb's office had a view of Midtown that Damien had always considered inferior to his own, which was why he had given it to Marcus in the first place. That was the kind of man Damien had been, the kind who calibrated generosity against the quiet maintenance of hierarchy, who gave good things as long as the best thing remained his. Claire noticed the view when she walked in the next morning. She noticed it the way she noticed all spaces, involuntarily, the architect's reflex that never fully switched off. The light came in from the south and east and landed well. Someone had put a small plant on the windowsill that was doing better than it had any right to in an office environment, which told her something about the person who kept it. Marcus stood when she came in. It was a broad-shouldered man with reading glasses pushed up on his forehead and the look of someone who had not slept particularly well but had decided to show up prepared anyway. There was a stack of folders on the conference table he'd set up in the corner of his office. Real folders, not presentation binders. She could tell the difference at a glance. "Mrs. Bennett," he said. "Claire," she said, "please." He nodded. He pulled out a chair and she sat, and he sat across from her, and for a moment they just looked at each other in the honest, slightly uncomfortable way of two people who are figuring out what the next thing is supposed to be. "How's the staff?" she asked. That was her first question. Not the financials, not the contracts, not the board. The people. Marcus seemed to register this. He leaned back slightly. Unsettled, he said. Some people are scared. The younger ones who've only ever known this as Damien's company. The ones who've been here longer. He paused. A few of them are relieved, honestly. I don't think that surprises you. It doesn't. He opened the first folder. I pulled the operational reports going back 18 months. The core New York portfolio. You know these buildings, most of them. They're performing well. The suburban expansion Damien pushed through in 2022, the 3 New Jersey developments, those are bleeding. I was warned twice by the financial team. He overruled them because the optics were good for the investor presentation. He said this flatly, without editorializing further, just putting it on the table. Claire looked at the numbers. They were not the numbers she had seen in the annual report. They were messier and more honest, the kind of numbers that live in internal spreadsheets and don't make it to the glossy pages. How bad is the New Jersey situation, she said. Manageable, if you move in the next 2 quarters. There's a regional developer, Kellerman Group out of Newark, who's been circling the Milburn project for 6 months. Fair offer, not spectacular, but it gets us out cleanly. You've already talked to them. I've had preliminary conversations, he said carefully. In an operational capacity. I didn't have authority to… Marcus. She looked up from the folder. I'm not auditing your judgment. If you talked to Kellerman because it was the right thing to do for the company, that's good instinct, and I want you to keep trusting it. She paused. I need to know what you've been doing, not because I'm looking for mistakes, but because I need to understand what's already in motion. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Damien didn't work that way. I know, she said simply. Another silence. The kind where something adjusts between 2 people. Not dramatically, not with any ceremony, just a small shift in what the room feels like. He walked her through the rest of it over the next 2 hours. The active contracts, the staffing levels, the 3 projects in various stages of development. There was a mixed-use building in Brooklyn, Greenpoint, on the waterfront, that had stalled at the design phase for 8 months because, Marcus explained with careful neutrality, the architect kept bringing Damien designs that Damien kept rejecting without being able to articulate what he actually wanted. Claire asked to see the drawings. Marcus spread them on the table and she stood over them for a moment in the way she had stood over drawings her whole career, since still, focused, the measuring part of her brain running quietly underneath everything else. He's solving the wrong problem, she said. The architect? Damien. He was looking at the facade when the issue is the interior sequence. The building doesn't know how to bring people in. She picked up a pen from Marcus's desk, not asking, just reaching for it, and made 4 marks on the drawing. Move the lobby here. Open this wall to the courtyard. The whole thing starts to breathe. Marcus looked at the 4 marks. He looked at them for a while. 8 months, he said quietly. 4 lines, she said. She set the pen down. Get me a meeting with the architect next week. She did not see Damien that day, or the day after. The board meeting happened on Thursday as Patricia had arranged it, in the Cross Holdings conference room on the 32nd floor, which was, technically, Claire's conference room now, though it didn't feel like hers yet in the way that rooms take time to feel like yours. The 3 independent directors arrived looking carefully neutral in the way of people who have decided before they enter a room that they are going to be professional about whatever they find there. Their names were Richard Hollis, Susan Park, and an older man named Bernard Chu, who had been on the board since the company's first outside funding round, and who Claire had met twice at company events, both times briefly, in the margins of occasions dominated by Damien's presence. Bernard Chu had said something to her once, at a company dinner in 2018. She had been standing near the bar not talking to anyone in particular when he had appeared beside her and said without preamble, "You have a good eye. The Riverside lobby. That entrance sequence was yours, wasn't it?" And she had said yes, without thinking, before she'd had a chance to construct the usual deflection, and he had nodded and said, "I thought so," and moved on. She had thought about that exchange many times in the years since. She looked at him now across the conference table, and he gave her a small, composed nod. Not surprised. Not uncomfortable. The nod of a man who had been waiting, with some patience, for the arrangement of a room to finally reflect the reality he had observed all along. She opened the meeting. She was not a person who needed to perform authority. She had noticed, over the years, that the people who most needed to perform it were the ones least sure they actually possessed it. She sat at the head of the table and spoke clearly and without excessive preamble about the company's current position, the operational challenges Marcus had identified, the path forward on the New Jersey projects, and her intention to complete the Greenpoint development with a renewed creative direction. Richard Hollis, who was the most guarded of the three, said, "I want to understand your operational experience going forward. You've been—" He paused, choosing his words. "You've been less directly involved with the company in recent years." "Less visibly involved," Claire said. "There's a difference." He held her gaze for a moment. "Fair enough," he said. Susan Park, who was a former real estate attorney and had the sharp evaluating quality of someone who spent her career reading between the lines of documents, leaned forward. "What's your position on Damien Cross's ongoing role, if any, with the company?" The room got quiet. Claire had thought about this. She had thought about it in Margaret's guest room at 5 in the morning, and in the back of the car on the way to Patricia's office, and in the space between conversations for 3 days. She had turned it over from every angle, looking for the place where her own feelings intersected honestly with what was right for the company and the people who worked in it. "He knows the New York real estate market as well as anyone in this city," she said. "He has relationships that took 20 years to build. Those have value." She folded her hands on the table. "His employment agreement expires in 14 months. I'm not going to terminate it early. What happens after that depends on whether he can function in a structure where he doesn't have unilateral authority." She paused. "That's an honest answer, not a generous one. I'm not doing him a favor. I'm doing what's right for the company." Bernard Chu, who had not yet spoken, said simply, "Good." The meeting ran 90 minutes. At the end of it, all three directors voted to affirm Claire's position as controlling owner and acting CEO. She shook their hands. Bernard Chu held hers a moment longer than the others. "Long overdue," he said quietly. She didn't disagree. Damien called on Friday afternoon. She was in the Greenpoint site, the actual building, the construction phase version of it, in work boots she'd bought that morning because she hadn't owned a pair in years and had needed them immediately. She was standing on the 3rd floor with the project foreman, looking at framing when her phone lit up with his name. She looked at it for a moment. The foreman politely turned his attention to something on his clipboard. She stepped away and picked up. "Damien," she said. A pause. Then his voice, which sounded like him, and also not quite like him. The same voice, but with something stripped from it, some layer of certainty that had always been present before. "I wasn't sure you'd answer," he said. "I almost didn't." Another pause. She heard him breathing. She had lived with the sound of that breathing for 22 years, known its different textures, the breathing of a confident man and a tired man, and a man who was about to say something he'd been rehearsing. This was the last kind. "I've been trying to find the right thing to say," he said. "I've been sitting with it for 4 days, and I don't think there is a right thing, so I'm going to say the true thing instead." She waited. "I took what you built and I made it mine in my head," he said. "Not all at once. I didn't sit down one day and decide to do it, but I did it, and I told myself a story about it that let me keep doing it, and I—" He stopped. "I don't have anything to offer you in exchange for that. I know that. I'm not calling to negotiate." She was quiet. Outside the open window frame of the 3rd floor, the East River was visible in the distance, gray-green in the afternoon light, and a barge was moving slowly north on it with the unhurried patience of something that doesn't need to be anywhere fast. "Why are you calling then?" she said. "Because I needed to say it to you, not to Gerald, not to a press statement, to you." A beat. "Because you were the one I took it from." She stood with that for a moment. The foreman was still studying his clipboard with professional commitment. The thing was, and she had not expected this, even after 4 days of processing, the thing was that it didn't fix anything. She had thought vaguely, in the abstract way you imagine future moments that haven't arrived yet, that if Damien ever said something like this, it would feel like a door opening, like resolution, like the particular relief of being acknowledged by the person who most needed to acknowledge you. What it actually felt like was quieter than that, more complicated. She felt something move in her chest, not warmth exactly, but something like the distant cousin of it. The feeling of hearing a true thing said plainly, after a long time of true things being avoided. It didn't undo anything, but it was real. "I know," she said, which was all she had, which was enough. He said, after a moment, "The company is good. Whatever happens with the employment situation, the company is good. You'll do well with it. I know that too, she said. There was a silence between them that was not comfortable but was not hostile either. It was the silence of two people who had been many things to each other and had run through all of them and arrived at the last one. Two strangers with 22 years of shared history standing on opposite sides of a line that had just been drawn. All right, he said. All right, she said. She hung up. She stood on the third floor of the Greenpoint building for a moment, looking at the framing, at the raw bones of the thing it was going to become. Then she put her phone in her pocket and turned back to the foreman. Show me the east wall again, she said. He nodded and walked her there, and she looked at it with the particular attention of someone who has learned, over a long career, to see what a thing wants to be before it knows itself. 3 months later, the Kellerman deal closed and the Milburn project was transferred cleanly, and the quiet internal narrative at Cross Holdings began to shift in the way that institutional narratives shift, not with a dramatic announcement, but by accumulation, by the daily reality of who was in the room and what they were saying and whose judgment was being trusted. Marcus had turned out to be exactly what Claire had assessed him as on that first phone call: direct, competent, loyal to the work, rather than to any particular version of power. They met every Tuesday morning. He brought the real numbers, and she brought the design perspective, and somewhere in the middle of those meetings, week by week, the company began to look more like what it should have been all along. She brought in 2 new architects for the Greenpoint project. A woman named Diane Chu, who had been doing work Claire had been admiring for 3 years, and a younger man fresh from his second independent project, who reminded her, in the best way, of herself at 30. She told Diane in their first meeting that she wanted the building to feel like an arrival rather than an entrance. Diane had looked at her for 1 second and then said, "Yes, exactly. That's the word, arrival," in the way people say things when they've been trying to articulate something and someone hands them the right language. They had been in productive disagreement about almost everything since, which was how Claire knew it was going to be good. The magazine profiles started in the second month. She declined most of them. She accepted one, a long piece in an architecture publication, not a business magazine, not a celebrity profile, but a piece that wanted to talk about design philosophy and the history of the New York residential market and the direction Cross Holdings was moving. She gave the interview in the Greenpoint building, in the half-finished lobby where the entrance sequence was finally coming together, and the journalist, a woman about her age who had done her research, asked her at one point what it had been like to watch her own creative work become invisible over 20 years. Claire was quiet for a moment. She could hear construction noise from 2 floors up. Somewhere in the building, a radio was playing something she didn't recognize. The afternoon light came in through the east windows and landed on the raw concrete floor in a way that was genuinely beautiful. Not because she had designed it that way, but because some spaces have good bones that reveal themselves when you strip away what's been covering them. It was like being a ghost, she said finally. You're in the room, you can see everything that's happening, and people look right through you. She paused. The difference between a ghost and a person is whether anyone acknowledges that you're there. She looked at the journalist. That's what the law did, in the end. It acknowledged that I was there. The piece ran 6 weeks later with a photograph of Claire standing in the Greenpoint lobby in work boots and reading glasses with a set of drawings under her arm, looking at something outside the frame. Not a posed photograph. The photographer had caught her in an actual moment when she was actually looking at something, and whatever she was looking at, her expression had the quality of a person who sees the thing she wants to make and believes completely that she can make it. It became, improbably, the most widely shared image from that issue. People sent it to each other with brief messages that said things like this, and yes, and finally, and sometimes nothing at all, just the image itself, because it communicated something that didn't need translation. Damien Cross spent the month after the ruling doing something unexpected. He was quiet. Not the strategic quiet of a man planning a comeback. Though Gerald had suggested the outline of one in a PR firm had been retained, and there were, certainly, lunch meetings with people who were interested in backing a new venture from a man with his experience. All of that was real and in motion. But underneath the mechanics of professional survival, something else was happening that Damien didn't discuss with Gerald or the PR firm or anyone. He was spending time in his apartment reading. Not business books. Not biographies of other powerful men, which had been his reading for 20 years. He was reading, of all things, architecture history. Not because anyone had suggested it, because he had found, in the back of a bookshelf in the study, a book that had been Claire's, a heavy academic thing about residential architecture in the mid-century, with her marginalia in the pages, her small, precise handwriting in the margins, noting things she found important, or disagreed with, or wanted to remember. He had sat down to put it back on the shelf and had read for 4 hours. He was not a man who was naturally inclined to self-examination. His whole life had been structured to avoid the particular discomfort of it, the forward motion, the next deal, the next building, the next headline. But some things, when they arrive, cannot be deferred past a certain point. He had arrived at that point, and there was nothing left to defer to, and so he sat with it. I thought about what he had actually built, distinguished carefully from what Claire had built, and understood with a clarity that was not comfortable that the honest version of the distinction left him with less than the story he'd been telling. He was good at negotiation. I was good at reading a deal. He had a genuine instinct for what the market wanted at any given moment. Those were real things. They had real value. They were not enough, by themselves, to have built what Cross Holdings became. They never had been. He thought about the early years, which he had not thought about honestly in a long time. The brownstone in Carroll Gardens, the way Claire had been, the pure unconditional certainty of her creative vision, the way she'd grabbed his arm and said, "Look at what this could be." He had borrowed money on the strength of that certainty. He had borrowed her eye and her belief and her family's savings and had built something extraordinary with them, and had then, slowly, consistently, over 20 years, edited her out of the story until even he believed the edited version. There was a word for what that was. He'd been avoiding it. One evening in his study with the architecture book open in his lap, he stopped avoiding it. He had not been honest. Not with the industry, not with the press, not with himself. He had been a man who took something and called it his own. And the law and his own negligence had eventually made that taking official and permanent, and then the same law had undone it. He didn't write this down. He didn't tell anyone. It wasn't a confession or a public reckoning. It was just a man alone in a room finally telling himself a true story about his own life, which is one of the hardest things a person can do and one of the most necessary. It didn't fix anything either. That was the thing that nobody tells you about genuine accountability. It doesn't come with relief. It doesn't balance the ledger. It just changes what you're carrying and how you're carrying it. He started a new company 4 months later, smaller. He called it DXV Development, and the first project was a modest mixed-use development in the Bronx, far from the Upper East Side world he'd operated in, partnering with a community development organization that had been trying to get the project funded for 3 years. Gerald thought it was a bad strategic move. The PR firm thought it was a good one. Damien did it because the project needed doing, and he knew how to do it, and that was, for the first time in a long time, enough of a reason. He kept the Park Avenue apartment. He did not replace Vanessa with anyone. He worked long days and came home to a quiet place and read architecture history in the evenings, which was an odd thing for a 60-year-old real estate developer to be doing, and which he could not entirely explain, even to himself. Vanessa Hale had moved back to a smaller apartment in Astoria, which was where she'd lived before Damien, and which she found, to her own slight surprise, that she didn't mind returning to. She had done what Claire suggested. She had gotten her own attorney, a practical woman named Rosa, who handled the dissolution of the financial arrangements efficiently and without drama. The Tribeca apartment was gone. The car was gone. The corporate credit card was gone. What remained was what Vanessa had started with. Her own savings, her own income from the marketing job she'd maintained through the relationship, because some part of her had always known, even when she was telling herself she didn't, that you should never let the floor underneath you become entirely someone else's floor. She thought about Claire sometimes. Not with guilt, exactly. Guilt was too simple for what the feeling actually was. It was more like the specific discomfort of having been, however unwittingly, a piece of a machine that hurt someone, and then becoming aware of it only after the machine had already run. She had been in the bathroom that day when Claire looked at her in the mirror. She had thought Claire was threatening her. She understood now, with the clarity of distance, that Claire had been doing something else entirely. She had been letting Vanessa see her clearly, maybe for the first time. Not as the rival, not as the betrayed wife, not as the obstacle, just as a person who had built things and had them taken and was about to take them back. That was worth something. She wasn't sure what to do with it yet, but it was worth something. She started running again, in the mornings, through Astoria Park along the water. She was not a person with a dramatic revelation about her life. She was a 29-year-old who had made some choices that had turned out badly and was now making different ones, which was ordinary and unremarkable, and also, in its quiet way, exactly what needed to happen. One morning in the park, she saw a woman about her mother's age sitting on a bench with a book and reading glasses. And the woman looked up when Vanessa ran by, and their eyes met for just a second, and the woman gave her a small smile. Not knowing her, not knowing anything about her, just the ordinary human acknowledgement of two people sharing a morning. And Vanessa smiled back without thinking and ran on, and felt, for approximately 30 seconds, the uncomplicated good feeling of being exactly where she was, doing exactly what she was doing, with no other claim on her attention. She thought, that's enough, for right now. That's actually enough. And so, Margaret called Claire on a Sunday in October, 3 months after the ruling, which was also the first genuinely cold day of the fall. The kind of day that comes in over New York with serious intent, turning the light silver gray and reminding the city that winter is not a metaphor. I want to show you something, Margaret said. Come over. She wouldn't say what over the phone, which was typical of Margaret, who had an instinct for the moments that needed to happen in person. Claire took the subway. She had been taking the subway more, since everything. Not because of the money was fine, but she had spent too many years insulated from the city by cars and doormen and the particular isolation of extreme wealth. And she was finding, in small daily ways, that she wanted the friction back. The subway was full of ordinary people doing ordinary things, and she found that she wanted to be among them in the unremarkable way. Margaret's apartment was warm and smelled like the soup she always made when the weather changed, and Margaret met her at the door and said, "In here," and led her to the small bedroom she used as a study, which had floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and a desk by the window, and had always been, to Claire, the most honest room she knew. A room that looked exactly like the person who lived in it. On the desk was a shoebox. Margaret had written Claire's name on the lid in her handwriting. "I found this when I was cleaning out the storage unit last month," Margaret said. "It's been in there since Mom's house was cleared out. I don't know why she kept it." Claire opened the box. Inside were drawings, old ones, on graph paper, and on the backs of envelopes, and on pages torn from notebooks. Architectural sketches, elevations and floor plans, and quick perspective drawings of rooms and staircases and facade details, all in a hand that Claire recognized immediately as her own. They were from college, from before Cross Holdings, from before Damien, from the years when she had drawn constantly, filling whatever surface was available, because she could not stop seeing what spaces could become and needed to put it somewhere. She lifted one carefully. A floor plan of something that was never built. A residential building, maybe 8 units, with a courtyard at the center and an entrance sequence that brought light in from 2 directions at once. She had no memory of drawing it, but she remembered the idea behind it. She had thought about it the way you think about a piece of music you love, understanding how it worked and why, knowing it was good. She set it on the desk and looked at it. She was 50 years old. She had spent the last 22 years of her life in the proximity of her own best instincts, without ever quite being allowed to trust them fully. She had built things that other people took credit for, and had been patient in ways that cost her more than she'd admitted at the time, and had waited for the law and documentation to give back what couldn't be given back any other way. And she was here, in her sister's study on a cold October Sunday, with a box of drawings made by a younger version of herself who had known, with a certainty that had never actually left her even when it was buried, known what spaces could become, known that things that looked broken had shapes inside them that wanted to be found. Margaret was leaning against the doorframe watching her. "You okay?" she said, which was what she always said, which was the question that had been the framework of their relationship for 40 years. Not because Claire was fragile, but because Margaret was the kind of person who made space for the honest answer. Claire looked at the drawing on the desk. At the entrance sequence, the courtyard, the light coming in from 2 directions. She thought about the Greenpoint building, where Diane Chu was currently arguing with her about the 3rd-floor window placement in a way that was productive and alive and exactly how creative work was supposed to go. She thought about Marcus Webb on Tuesday morning with his real numbers and his plant on the windowsill. She thought about this board meeting and Bernard Chu's small nod and the photograph in the architecture magazine and the 40,000 people who had shared the headline about a woman who walked into court and walked out with everything. She thought about the brownstone in Carroll Gardens in 2002, the measuring tape and the sketchbook and the grabbing of Damien's arm and the saying of look at what this could be. She thought about being that certain and then spending 20 years having that certainty slowly, imperceptibly ground down. Not dramatically, not all at once, but grain by grain, the way water does its work on stone. She thought about what it had taken to still be standing. Yeah, she said. She picked up the drawing carefully and put it back in the box. I'm okay. She put the lid on the box. She sat with it for another moment, the way you sit with something that matters. Not trying to extract meaning from it, not trying to make it into a lesson, just letting it be what it was. Margaret, in the doorway, said quietly, She kept everything you ever made, you know, every card, every drawing. She thought you were the most talented person she'd ever known. A pause. She told me that the last year. She said she always thought you'd find your way back to it. Claire's throat tightened. She swallowed it down with the discipline of a woman who has swallowed many things, but not because she was ashamed of it, just because she wasn't ready to cry about this in the particular way it deserved yet, and she needed a little more time. Soup's ready, Margaret said, with the perfect instinct of a person who knows when to let something be. Yeah, Claire said. Good. She picked up the box. She carried it with her to the kitchen, and she sat at the same table she had sat at through everything, and Margaret put soup in front of her, and they ate together in the warm, ordinary silence of two sisters who have known each other long enough that not everything needs to be said. Outside, the October wind was running up the street and the last of the leaves were off the trees, and the city was doing what the city always did, pushing forward, indifferent to anyone's private reckoning, full of people in their own versions of their own stories, all of them navigating between what they built and what was taken and what remained. Claire Bennett had learned something over the previous 50 years that she suspected most people needed longer to learn, or never learned at all. She had learned that the most permanent things about a person are not their victories or their possessions or the things that carry their name. They are the things they know how to do when no one is watching, the eye that sees what a space could become, the hand that draws the 4 lines, the refusal, quiet and absolute, to sign anything you don't mean. Those things could not be transferred, could not be taken in a courtroom or an office or a marriage, could not be erased from the record by a man who decided to rewrite history because the history was in the doing of it, in the rooms themselves, in the buildings still standing with their good bones and their particular light. She had those. She had always had them. The company was hers. The drawings were hers. The future, finally, was hers. She finished her soup. She set down her spoon. She looked at her sister across the table. The Greenpoint building is going to be something, she said. Margaret looked at her in the particular way she had, the smile that started in her eyes and took a moment to reach the rest of her face, the smile of someone watching a person they love be, at last, entirely themselves. Tell me about it, she said. And Claire did.